My talk is going to focus mostly on some of the findings from my most recent book, The Myth of Mob Rule. But I'm going to fill in a bit with some of my previous work and then some of my the stuff I'm working on now, in particular, some concepts that I'm developing to try to understand the intersection between crime and punishment and racial disparities in the Americas. So let me begin with something that I think you probably are all familiar with, which is what some people call mass incarceration, others call the carceral state. Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, which is the fact that the United States is really exceptional in the number of people in prison, the percent of the population in prison, the racial disparities in imprisonment, and not just in imprisonment, but in punitiveness more broadly. We're really exceptional in terms of sentences like life without the possibility of parole. We're exceptional in terms of things like solitary confinement. We're exceptional in terms of police killing of citizens. And again, all of those things also have deep racial disparities, particularly between African Americans and whites, with African Americans being much more exposed to these kinds of actions and state actions than others. And scholars who work in this field call this a kind of American criminal justice exceptionalism. Exceptionalism meaning the United States is exceptional, not in a positive sense, but truly exceptional relative to all the other countries we generally compare ourselves with, whether it's NATO countries or OECD countries or other rich democracies, whatever comparisons you want to make. We are really exceptional in criminal justice in terms of the volume of people we imprison, incapacitate, and the ways in which we treat people in the prison system. And of course, again, with very, very deep and alarming racial disparities. So this is, I probably don't need to do this, but just to refresh those of you who aren't so familiar with this, this is prison populations in developed democracies, and you can see the United States has a very, is extremely high relative to all these other countries, and we could look at other countries, apparently even more than Russia. We imprison people. I wonder sometimes if we're getting the full numbers from Russia, but in any case, we don't typically think of ourselves as a nation that would be like Belarus or Russia in terms of incarceration. And of course, very, very, very deep racial disparities. This just shows you sort of by race and gender. You can see that there are extreme differences, and this is just the number of the sort of people under the criminal justice system in one way or another. So it's not just imprisonment, it's also being under supervision and probation and parole and so on. And you can see that the disparities are just alarming. I mean, they're high to begin with, right? 1 in 17 white men, but 1 in 3 African-American men, 1 in 6 Latino men. Very, very, very extreme levels of criminal justice contact and also extreme racial disparities. So relative to other democracies, we imprison people 4, 5, 8, 10 times as much as other rich democracies in particular. But this sort of fascination with and condemnation of U.S. exceptionalism in punitiveness has almost entirely eclipsed a related phenomenon that is also exceptional, which is the disproportionately high rates of very serious violent victimization in the United States relative to other democracies, and again, very deep racial disparities in that victimization. And my work, which began in the 1990s actually as a graduate student, which was the sort of apex of a long and violent crime wave that I'll talk about, has tried to understand the relationship between crime and punishment, focusing on the nature of American political institutions and on the persistence of a white supremacist ideology that intersects with those institutions in ways that I argue perpetuate both high rates of violence and high rates of imprisonment. So I've written 3 books on this subject. And I've sort of gradually, over the course of these books, come to the conclusion that we can't really understand American punitiveness without understanding American violence, and that seeing these two phenomena together can actually reveal a great deal about the nature of American politics, the ways in which white supremacist ideology continues to affect American politics, and the persistence of racial disproportionality in both crime victimization and in criminal punishment. So what I'm going to do today, I'll just give you a little roadmap of what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend a little bit of time illustrating the high rates of lethal violence in particular in the United States. And I'm going to spend some time on this because it's not something that we have, I think, fully appreciated. And in order to understand the argument I'm going to make about the nature of American government and what I call a kind of racialized failed state, we have to understand high rates of lethal violence. Lethal violence is also an extraordinary political issue, one that's actually been neglected by political scientists. Most people who study lethal violence are in sociology and criminology, and they don't really have much to say about what I call the political origins of lethal violence. That is, what are the reasons why some countries have such high rates of intentional homicide and others don't? And particularly rich countries like the United States, where we might expect our homicide rates to be very low. So I argue that lethal violence is in fact a very important political issue. Rapidly rising rates of lethal violence or very high rates are a kind of existential crisis, a kind of social crisis akin to high unemployment, akin to fears of terrorism, spreading of communicable diseases. So this is a political concern that as I have found over 20 years of research and local, state, national, and cross-national politics, is an issue that the public writ large expects the government to do something about. So then I want to link American punitiveness and American violence with a concept that I call racialized state failure. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what I mean by racialized state failure, and provide some examples from the United States. And essentially, what I mean by racialized state failure, and I hope it becomes clear over the course of my talk, is essentially the failure of a nation state to successfully fulfill a core state obligation, which is security from violence, not just external threat, but also internal threat. And then the subsequent failure, the subsequent use by the state of extremely high levels of imprisonment and state violence towards its citizens. So it's a kind of dual risk of violence for the polity, both from intentional homicide and from the state. Then hopefully I'll have time, and I want to situate the U.S. in this larger context of the Americas that is a new project I'm working on, where I theorize the political origins of lethal violence a little bit more broadly in the context of the Americas, and I'll talk very briefly about why the Americas. So let me begin with talking a bit about homicide. Again, why homicide? Well, if we think about crime very broadly, there are lots of things that people might be worried about. But research is pretty clear that the thing that people fear most is violent victimization for themselves and for their loved ones. And so when you have a period of time where serious violent crime is rapidly rising, you have a serious political problem, and a problem that people begin to demand that the government do something about. In fact, when I began my research in the 1990s, and then into the 2000s in urban high crime areas, the level of mobilization was extraordinary in terms of people trying to confront high rates of violent victimization, high rates of homicides, and people connected these problems to a wide range of other issues, schools and housing and job opportunities and abandoned buildings and city services, a whole range of sort of public institutional expectations that were not being met, and homicide is sort of the end result of that. So what does the United States look like just generally in terms of homicide rates? So I've just chosen a few countries here, countries that we might think of as sort of like us. And if we look at homicide rates per 100,000 people over this 60-year period, here's Canada, here's Belgium, here's Denmark, and it's a little hard to see here, but all of these countries have a rise in homicide over this period, every single one of them. And I'm just using a few examples here, but we could go through all of Western and Eastern Europe. We could go through Japan and a lot of other Asian countries, and it would look very similar. This is the Netherlands, England and Wales. Are you ready for the United States? So there are a couple things to notice about this. First of all, the lowest homicide rates in the United States over the past 60 years are higher than the highest homicide rates in every other country that we would compare ourselves to, NATO countries, OECD countries, and it's dramatic. And if we take out Canada for a moment, which for reasons we might want to do from, sorry, just making sure that's not me. If we take out Canada just for a moment, you can see that the United States has at the peak of homicide rates from sort of the early 70s into the mid 90s, have homicide rates that are actually an order of magnitude higher than a lot of these other countries, 10 times higher, right? So very dramatic. And the other thing, of course, is to notice this massive crime wave, right, that happens. And violent crime, serious violent crime and homicide actually track pretty closely with one another. So if you look at violent crime rates, you're going to see similar trajectories over this time period. And particularly, I want you to notice how rapidly serious violence increases in the 1960s and into the early 1970s, and then how it stays very high relative to earlier periods, and then again how rapidly it declines in the last bit of the 1990s and into the 2000s. Now, some people say this is all because of guns. A lot of it is guns, but it's not all guns. The United States is a more violent country, even if we exclude firearms from looking at violence. So this is just homicides per 100,000 that aren't with guns. So we have a lot of gun violence, but we also kill each other in other ways at much higher rates than other countries do. Of course, there are stark racial differences in homicide victimization. So this is victimization. This is not offending. This is victims. And you can see, first of all, that the homicide rate has declined dramatically in the past, 20 years? Yeah, 20 years. But the racial disparities are very, very dramatic. So African Americans are murdered at a rate about 6 or 7 times that of white Americans. And I refer to this as exposure to homicide, right? Exposure to the conditions that make people more at risk, more or less at risk, or more or less insulated from murder. So what I want to do now actually is show you, just because it's difficult to think about homicide rates in terms of hundreds of thousands of people, right? So I want to show you another way of thinking about homicide in the United States relative to other rich countries, just to illustrate, I think in a fairly dramatic fashion, how distinctive we are, how exceptional the United States is. So what I did in the book was to create what I call a life risk estimate. And it's very artificial. It doesn't actually mean anything, because what I do is I say, let's say you were born at the peak of homicide. Let's say you were born in 1972, which was a very high year of homicide, and you lived your whole life with the homicide being that high. What could you expect your life expected? What would be your odds, essentially, of being murdered, right? So it's artificial, because the homicide rates, as we saw, go up and down. Nobody lives their whole life with a homicide rate as extreme as it was in 1972 or 1992, but it's a useful exercise to do across countries. So I'm going to show you are these estimates across a couple of different European countries and the US. In 1960, when homicide rates were quite low across US and Europe, and then at the peak of homicide rates in each of these countries. And I'm going to do this first generally, and then I'm going to break it down by race. So basically what I'm showing you is the actual homicide rate in 1960 and the peak of homicide rates. This is per 100,000. And then the life risk at the peak. So if you were born in the Netherlands I think the peak was in 2001, and you lived your whole life with a homicide rate in the Netherlands of 1.3 per 100,000 people, your risk of being murdered over the course of a 75-year life would be about 1 in 970, right? So pretty low risk, right? That's, I think, about the risk of slipping and falling in your shower and dying. So it's pretty unusual, right? Most people don't know somebody who was murdered, just like most of us, I hope, don't know somebody who slipped and died in their shower, right? It's like being struck by lightning, very unusual. The risk is greater in England and Wales and greater in Scotland. That includes Scotland, because Scotland is one of the more violent countries in Europe. But you can see that even if we take one of the most violent countries in Europe, Scotland, and this is largely because of Glasgow, which is a pretty violent city, even still, the risk is much more remote than it is in the United States. And if we just look for a minute at that 1 in 130, so if you were born in the early 1970s or the mid 1990s, when the peak homicide rate was about the same in both those periods, and your whole life was that homicide rate, about 1 in 130 people would be murdered. Now, by adulthood, we all know 130 people. Hundreds of thousands of people, it's hard to imagine a homicide rate going from 5 to 10, 100,000 people, right? But when we think about it this way, it's much more stark. And I'd like to ask a question, actually. There are a lot of young people in this room, so maybe this won't work, but I'd like to just see by a show of hands, how many people know someone, doesn't have to be a friend, doesn't have to be someone you knew well, but just somebody that you met in person at least once in your life that you later found out had been murdered? Could I just see a show of hands? Yeah. Look around you. And I see a lot of young people raising their hands too, which is interesting because my generation, if you look at that crime, I mean, that was like, this crime wave is like my lifetime. I'm not saying it's causal. I'm just saying that I was born at the beginning of this this arc. So I remember it very, very well, as probably many of you do, in terms of how cities feel today compared to 30 years ago. Anyway, that's a lot of hands that went up. And when I give this talk related to the book in Europe, I see maybe 2 hands in a room, this number of people. And most of the people in the room turn around and say, who do you know that was murdered? And ironically, sometimes the person says, it was an American. So let me now show you racial disparities. And this, I'm just going to do white and black and then show you African-American homicide victimization rates by gender, because that's also very important. So let me just walk you through this. And this is actually incorrect. I apologize. This is wrong. These 2 numbers here, I don't know how that happened. The actual white rate of murder in 1960 was about 3 per 100,000. And the actual white rate in 1960, the actual black rate in 1960 was about 23. Sorry, those are wrong. But the point is to look at the peak numbers. And if we look at the rate of white homicide victimization at the peak, which was, again, sort of 1970s and then again in the 90s, the risk over a lifetime would be 1 in 238, which is still significantly higher than the risk in Scotland and much, much higher than the risk in any of these other countries. And I want to highlight this because it's very important as I go through this. It's very important to the way I think about and analyze and what I have found here to understand that lethal violence is not an African-American problem. It's an American problem to which African-Americans are exceptionally exposed, at risk, right? And that's a very important piece of understanding what I'm trying to argue. But look at so if you look at African-Americans, look at the difference in risk exposure. If you had lived your whole life, if you were born in 1972 or 1991 as an African-American and you lived your whole life with homicide risk that high, 1 in 34, that's astounding. And when we consider the racial breakdown, it's heartbreaking. If you're an African-American male and you were born in 1972 and your whole life was homicide rates that were about 77 murders per 100,000 African-American men, your homicide risk would be about 1 in 17. It is staggering, and it's also strikingly similar to the risk of murder in some of the highest murder places in the world. Parts of El Salvador, Honduras, which has some of the highest murder rates in the world. Some parts of the Caribbean. These are murder rates that are the kinds of murder rates that we see in countries that are collapsing or having all kinds of problems with governance, and a whole wide range of the kinds of expectations we have from government are incapacitated. So that's an extremely important concept for what I want to do, because I want us to understand both the extremely high risk of imprisonment and violence from the state alongside extremely high rates of lethal violence. And I focus on lethal violence for reasons that I explained earlier, but I do want us to think about the fact that these are very high rates of homicide, but if you factor in life-threatening violence, if you factor in other forms of violent crime, aggravated assault, and so on, this is a lot of people at risk. And of course, deep and devastating racial disparities. Again, this is just highlighting the fact that this is really an American problem. And I highlight this because often when I talk about this, especially when I'm in Europe, people will say, people very sympathetic to the problems of racial inequality in the United States will say, well, isn't this because the United States has just essentially abandoned African Americans in terms of state building and the conditions that might make these things less common? And I say that can't be the whole story, because we're seeing violence higher for whites as well. Although, as you'll see, I do want to argue that this is primarily about race, just perhaps not in the ways that we often think. So what explains this? Okay, so this is my puzzle, right? So most of the people who work in the area of mass incarceration focus only on the imprisonment side. And I want to look at these two things together. And I see them as what I've called a kind of illustration or symptomatic of racialized state failure. What do I mean by racialized state failure? Well, the concept of state failure in the political science literature is fairly contested. What's a failed state? How do we know when a state's failed versus failing or collapsing? What's a successful state, right? A failed state depends on having a shared understanding of what success is. So I don't want to get bogged down in all of that. What I want to do is just borrow from the failed state literature the two concepts. The concept of first, a kind of high levels of predatory violence, so higher levels of violence than you would expect. And again, just comparing the US to the countries that are similar to us in economic development and democratic institutions, were exceptionally high. And then also high levels of violent actions from the state. So one of the sort of symptoms of failed states are when state actors themselves are engaged in violence towards the citizenry with little accountability. So you see perhaps police, law enforcement or police forces operating in ways that are extremely aggressive and lethal with very little consequence. And then conflict between law enforcement and factional groups. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, we could see this in terms of sort of police and Black Panthers. But again, thinking more broadly, we could think about Waco, Texas, or the Branch Davidians, other sort of armed militia, right? White armed militia groups and standoff with law enforcement. So sorry, you can see quite all that, but the way I want to think about racialized state failure is when state building has failed to produce the kinds of conditions that would minimize, the kinds of policies that would minimize the social conditions that give rise to lethal violence, and when state building has failed to produce limitations and constraints on police and criminal justice institutions in ways that would minimize people's exposure to them in their daily lives. So what is the source of this? If I'm making this claim that there's this thing called racialized state failure, what does it look like, and how do we know, or what causes it, right? So I argue that there are two overlapping and intersecting features of American politics that result in racialized state failure. The first is what I call racialized anti-statism, which is a sort of persistent white opposition to the positive state. And I don't mean the entire white population at all times in history. I don't even always mean the majority of the white population, but a persistent and vociferous portion of the white electorate that actively opposes state policies that would ameliorate a whole wide range of social conditions that result in lethal violence, right? And this opposition results in what we know as a kind of American exceptionalism in the welfare state, which is that we're sort of known as a welfare state laggard in the sense that we don't produce the same kinds of assistance for people from the consequences of a whole wide range of modern risks like unemployment and the health and disease issues and so on. So that's a very important part of my argument because because the opposition to what I'm calling the positive state, or sort of state building mechanisms that lift populations into conditions that allow them to be productive and schooling and jobs and so on, community, is important to understand as racialized. And that intersects with what people who study American politics call institutional fragmentation, which I think Americans more generally call checks and balances. But which we also call veto points. So we celebrate checks and balances, like, yay us, we have all these ways that we check other branches of government. But political scientists think about these institutions as veto points, meaning that groups that are not in the political majority can find ways to block political majorities, right? So I'm going to give some examples to sort of give life to this in a minute. But let me just give a couple of sort of theoretical examples. So we know, for example, that countries that have federal systems like ours have lower social welfare spending. And one of the reasons for that is because you created points in the political system where some group can win and decide we don't want to spend that money on social welfare. So maybe you have a region that rejects federal spending on some health issue, or maybe you have to get all the regions to agree to get the national spending, and one region disagrees. And so you have these places in the political system where a very determined political minority can actually stop the legislative process from happening. So another example of this is separation of powers and bicameralism. So we have two chambers of Congress, co-equal in their lawmaking instead of one. We have an executive that's elected separately, and these parties all have to agree to get things done. We call it gridlock, right, when they don't get things done. Again, political scientists call this a status quo bias, which is that it's hard to do things. It's hard to change the status quo. So that means in the wake, for example, of rising violent crime rates, it's very difficult to get something passed through a legislative body that would maybe ameliorate the conditions giving rise to crime. Although for reasons I'll illustrate in a moment, not so hard to get punitive policies through. And then another example is Senate malapportionment. So every state has 2 senators, right? Vast disparities in population. 38 million people in California, less than 500,000 people in Montana. Both have 2 senators. And I'll illustrate one of the consequences of that. So this fragmentation, I argue, creates opportunities for a vociferous portion of the white electorate to resist state building in ways that produce social conditions that encourage economic, political, social, cultural development. So let me give you a first example actually from separation of powers. So one of the things I did in the book was to sort of revisit the Clinton era, the Bill Clinton era. And Bill Clinton gets a lot of criticism, I think with good reason, for the 1994 crime bill. I mean, one of the things people say is crime was coming down when this bill happened. But if you remember my slide, yeah, crime had just started to come down. Nobody could really foresee the plummet that was going to happen in the late 1990s. But if we look at the sort of what we call wins and losses, so what does Clinton win on and what does he lose on in terms of the kinds of policies proposed in the Democratic Party platform, in the State of the Union speeches he gave? And in the first 2 years of his presidency, when he had a Democratic Congress, he got some key wins. He got the earned income tax credit, he got gun control, and of course the notorious crime bill. But look at the things he didn't get through Congress, despite the fact that his party controlled Congress. And the Democratic Party had campaigned on economic stimulus. You can go back and read the party platform. You can read his State of the Union speeches. And economic stimulus was high on the Democratic agenda, as was healthcare reform. And many of you probably remember the collapse of healthcare reform, right? But it gets even worse when Congress becomes Republican after 1994, because now we have deep opposition to any kind of thing that President Clinton wants to do that might be sort of comprehensive social policy. So the minimum wage hike fails. It eventually does pass, actually, just before the end of Clinton's term. Broader ranging gun control beyond the Brady bill also fails. Efforts to create more funding and more comprehensive childcare opportunities also fails. So in seeing sort of programmatic processes like this, we can see the ways in which this fragmented system creates opportunities for people opposed to these kinds of policies to block them, even when political majorities support them. And in all of these cases, there was large public support, broadly speaking, for all of these policies. Now I know some of you are thinking, what about right now? Aren't we glad that we have checks and balances? I can talk about that later if you want. I'm not going to talk about it right now. But I want you to think, for the purposes of this, I want you to think just about crime and punishment, right? So just notice the ways in which it's very difficult, even when a party controls all 3 branches, to get comprehensive policy through. But then we can look at this actually a little more systematically. So I took all of the key social welfare and crime bills from 1968 to 2014 and looked at the sort of arrangement, the configuration of government at the time. And if we look at big social welfare policies, these are policies that got passed. I can talk more about what I included here. It's housing, it's healthcare, it's job training and economic stimulus. I'm not remembering all of the details, but those are the kinds of policies that are in the social welfare category. And notice the distinction, first of all, between social welfare and crime. So if you want to pass big social welfare policies that you think might alleviate suffering of a whole range of kinds, right, including, in my view, lethal violence, you pretty much have to have at least a fully Democratic Congress, at least, over these past 50 years. If you can get Democratic unified government, good. But in the absence of those two things, it's very, very unlikely that you can get some kind of comprehensive social policy reform passed. But look at crime. Crime bills pass under every configuration of government practically. It doesn't really matter. Why is that? Well, this is what I call lowest legislative denominator politics. But to understand it, you have to believe my argument that crime matters. Because if violence matters, then what we see is public demand for government to do something. And if you are proposing a range of policies like gun control and longer sentences for serious violent offenders and early childhood education programs and childcare programs, right, and other things you might help prevent risk of violence, the only thing everyone will agree on is the punishment. And I show this in party platforms over 50 years, that both parties were perfectly willing to do more police and more prisons and longer sentences. But other things like gun control and more comprehensive crime preventive policies were only put forth by the Democratic Party and largely killed in the process of separation of powers and bicameralism. And by the way, sometimes killed by members of their own party, not just by Republicans, right? So this is I think, a very important argument for understanding one of the reasons we get punishment and nothing else. Not because there was this sort of singularly minded view that we should only do more punishing. Certainly some people had that view. But the public was actually broadly supportive of a range of policies to deal with crime. But they only get punishment. And by the way, in the earlier work I did on community mobilization around crime, this idea of seeing crime as part of violent crime as part of a larger set of problems and issues, right, is very common in communities experiencing high crime, but also among a lot of people who a lot of working class Americans, a lot of people sort of living in conditions of risk in other ways, understand the link between crime and sort of broader state building processes, and yet, we have this process whereby punitiveness slides through. We can all agree, more police, we're doing something, and the other policies get blocked. So this is really hard to see. All I want you to do is look at the bottom line. This is an example of the problem of Senate malapportionment. So these are the votes on the Senate bill, which many of you may remember. Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, Republican and Democrat, proposed a bill after the shooting in Connecticut, the Sandy Hook shooting that killed 27 children, I think. And they proposed a bill that would just close the loophole about background checks at gun shows. It's not even clear that would have mattered in the case, but just a very simple thing. You don't have to pass a background check if you buy a gun at a gun show. This bill would have said, well, now you do. Americans, by the way, the polling data was very clear on this. A friend of mine once joked, I think more Americans supported the background check bill than would have actually passed the background check bill, right? So in the 80%, right? Yes, make people pass a background check if they buy a gun at a gun show. But the bill failed. 48 votes in favor of it, 52 votes against it, right? 52 out of 100, you lose. But look at the populations represented by these senators. So a clear majority of people represented in the Senate preferred the bill. But because every state has 2 senators, there's deep malapportionment in representation, right? There's a very distinctive mechanism whereby you can block lots of things in the Senate if you just get the right states together. And those states sometimes actually represent, especially if you look at the committee system, sometimes represent a very small percentage of the American population. I should have put it here, you should be surprised how small some American states are. We're actually kind of in one. We're in a state that's not relatively that populous relative to states like Texas and California and New York and Illinois and Pennsylvania and so on. I think I have one more example. Okay, one more example is judicial review and federalism. So some of you may know in 2012, the Supreme Court heard a case about the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And though the Supreme Court decided that the law was in fact constitutional, thank you very much, Congress could pass this bill, they said that the portion of the bill that required states to expand eligibility for Medicaid was not constitutional, allowing states to decide for themselves, right? The great old states' rights argument, right? Well, which states have not expanded Medicaid? I need to update this. This may not be 100% up to date at the moment, but as of several years later, many states did not expand Medicaid. Some states now are demanding referendum by the public to force the state to expand Medicaid, right? But let's notice the states that didn't expand Medicaid initially. States mostly in the South and through the Midwest. And these states, if you actually look at the voters, look at the states that are voting against gun control, look at the states that are consistently and persistently voting against comprehensive social policies that might reduce risk of being victimized. It is a consistent set of states. They tend to be the states in the South and states in the Middle West. I could do this all day long. With examples. I could do this all day long with examples of political majorities supporting a set of policies being thwarted by the institutions of American politics. So what I argue is that this intersection of, that should say racialized autocorrect. I hate autocorrect. It always changes racialized to radicalized. Sorry. The intersection of racialized anti-statism and institutional fragmentation disrupts state building, disrupt the collective action capacity of states, nation states, and individual states to produce social goods, produce social policies that might insulate people from lethal violence. And then in a kind of feedback loop, we double down on those institutions when we do have rising violence and result in largely punitive policies in response. So let me take this a step further. If I'm already stretching your thinking, I'm really going to stretch you now. So I want to go a step further and say, is this only true of the United States? And by the way, let me just go back 1 minute and say, when I say racialized state failure, again, I recognize that I'm using the term state failure for a country that most people would never in a million years think of as a failed state. And I want to be very clear that I'm using it in that way specifically in relation to violence and in relation to the intersection of crime and punishment. And observing in the United States, in relation to other rich democracies, the kinds of things we would not expect from an otherwise economically successful state, right? And a pluralist state that has as many wide range of interest groups and civic capacity and so on. So it turns out, actually, that the Americas, from Canada to Tierra del Fuego, have 14% of the world's population and 33% of the world's intentional homicides. So this, again, as a social scientist, can't resist. It's a puzzle. Why is that? So what I'm working on now is trying to develop this concept of racialized state failure and understand it in more historical terms, and try to understand how the legacy of colonialism, both extractive colonialism and settler colonialism and slavery, affects how states get built, how they get constructed, and how efforts to maintain European supremacy disrupt that state building in ways that result in high levels of lethal violence and high levels of state violence. And it's a very complicated project because I'm not a historian, for one, but also there's not a lot of theorizing about what is that mechanism between how states are, what they do, and how they're built, and violence. There's a lot of sociology on the causes of homicide. There's a lot of criminology. It's pretty localized. It's pretty based in communities. But my question as a political scientist is, why do some communities have higher risk of these things than others? And why do some nations as a whole have much higher risk than others? And why are the Americas the outlier? It is kind of dramatic if you look at the map. So the darker the color, the higher homicide rate. And even though now, unfortunately, there are estimates in a number of countries where it's hard to get accurate data. So I admit that the data are not always entirely clear, but these are aggregate rates over many long periods of time. So we're fairly confident that they're accurate. And the Americas really stand out. relative to other parts of the world. And so I'm theorizing the origins and the cause of this, and what I'm focusing on is, again, borrowing from what I've learned about the US, is the ways in which constructing state institutions and political systems is hard to do under any conditions, but particularly when a dominant group is trying to make sure they maintain dominance. And in contrast to European countries who construct these kind of more democratic social welfare states in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and 20th century, which are very homogenous. You know, the other countries I was showing you, they're very homogenous countries. And no history really of settler colonialism or slavery on the continent. It's easier to establish mechanisms whereby everybody gets some kind of say if you're not trying to ensure that one group remains at the top. And so fragmentation is a mechanism whereby you can ensure that the construction of broad social policy is very difficult, even when you get a coalition of a political majority that prefers it. So just by way of last thing, just to illustrate my what I hope will be moderately persuasive, I just put together a small table of, that's my theory, I'll skip that. I just put together a small table of some countries from, I did all the countries in Latin America and all the countries in Europe, although I'm only showing you a few, but the averages include everyone. And if you look at the top part, which is Latin America, the United States clearly belongs in Latin America on all of these measures. In terms of the political system, I use presidential system as an example of fragmented separation of powers. None of the European countries, or actually only one of them, it's not listed here, has a presidential system. They're all parliamentary systems. Europe has very low heterogeneity and very low imprisonment rates and very low homicides. And the Americas, including the United States, are in a whole other category in terms of institutions and in terms of lethal violence and in terms of state violence. So this is where I am now. This is very preliminary. I'll answer any questions. I'll defend my argument in the US. I'm a little on murkier ground in the broader the broader project because I'm just beginning. But the bottom line is that I argue that we really can't understand American exceptionalism in criminal justice without understanding American exceptionalism in serious violence. And then if we look at those two things together as two sides of the same coin of state responsibility for security from violence, we have a better understanding both of why the United States is such an outlier and also why it has such deep racial disparities. And thank you very much.